It started with a bouquet of roses. Emma found them neatly placed on her porch, the crimson petals so perfect they seemed unreal. A card was tucked inside, reading only, "For you." There was no name, no indication of who had sent them. She chalked it up to a harmless admirer or maybe a delivery gone wrong. But when another bouquet appeared 2 days later, and then another the day after that, unease began to creep in. Emma lived alone in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind where everyone prided themselves on their safety. Her routine was predictable. Work at the small-town library, grocery shopping on Wednesdays, a morning jog every Saturday. The monotony of her life was comforting until the roses disrupted it. She started noticing other oddities. A faint click on her phone line when she answered calls. The sensation of being watched even in crowded spaces. One evening, after returning from work, she found something new on her porch. It wasn't flowers this time, but a small black box tied with a red ribbon. Heart pounding, she brought it inside and placed it on her kitchen table. She hesitated for a moment, then untied the ribbon and opened the box. Inside was a key. A shiny silver key with no note or explanation. Emma's first thought was that it might belong to a neighbor. She checked her doors and windows, ensuring they were locked, and resolved to ask around the next day. But that night, as she lay in bed, she was jolted awake by the sound of soft scratching at her front door. She froze, clutching her blanket, straining to hear through the silence. The scratching stopped, but the unease lingered. The next morning, her mailbox contained a single photograph. It was of her, sitting at the library's front desk. The angle was odd, as if the photo had been taken from outside the window. Her heart raced as she scanned the street for anyone watching, lice dead, but there was no one. She debated calling the police, but feared being dismissed. Instead, she confided in her friend and coworker, Claire. "You need to take this seriously, Emma," Claire said, her face pale. "This isn't some lovesick admirer. This is stalking." That evening, Emma installed a security camera on her porch. She left all the lights on, checked the locks repeatedly, and clutched her phone as she lay in bed. Around 2 a.m., the motion alert from her camera jolted her awake. She opened the app with trembling fingers and saw a figure standing in her yard. It was a man, tall and wearing dark clothing, his face obscured by the shadows. He stood motionless, staring directly at the camera. Then, with deliberate slowness, he raised a hand and waved. Emma called the police, her voice shaking as she described the intruder. By the time they arrived, the man was gone. They found no evidence except for faint footprints in the dirt outside her window. The officers assured her they would patrol the area, but offered little comfort. The next day, she couldn't focus at work. Every creak, every shadow made her jump. Claire suggested staying with her for a while, but Emma insisted on not letting the stalker disrupt her life. She bought heavier curtains, changed her locks, and kept a can of pepper spray within arm's reach. But the stalker was relentless. Over the next week, she received more photographs, each more invasive than the last. One showed her sleeping in bed, her face serene, oblivious to the camera's intrusion. She started to wonder if the key she'd received was for her own house. She began sleeping in short, fitful bursts, her exhaustion feeding her paranoia. One night, as she was brushing her teeth, her phone buzzed with a notification. Another motion alert. She opened the app and saw the same man standing on her porch, holding up something small. It was the key. Her heart stopped as she realized he was turning it toward her door. She didn't think. She ran. Barefoot and trembling, she grabbed her phone and bolted out the back door, sprinting into the night. She could hear her front door creaking open behind her, the sound of heavy boots following her onto the grass. She didn't dare look back. Emma ran to Claire's house, pounding on the door until her friend opened it. She collapsed inside, sobbing, barely able to explain what had happened. Claire called the police, who arrived moments later. This time, they took her seriously. They found her door wide open, the house ransacked, but the stalker was gone. Emma didn't return home. She stayed with Claire while the police investigated, but the man was never caught. The flowers, the photographs, the key, all remained a mystery. She eventually moved to a new city, changed her name, and tried to rebuild her life. But some nights when she's alone, she feels it again, that sensation of being watched. And sometimes when she checks her porch, she swears she catches the faintest scent of roses. It began on a crisp November evening when Grace first noticed the man. He was standing across the street from her apartment, leaning against a lamppost, his face partially hidden by the brim of a hat. At first, she didn't think much of it. People loitered in the neighborhood all the time. But when she glanced outside again an hour later, he was still there, motionless, staring directly at her window. The next day, he was back. This time he stood closer, just on the edge of the sidewalk. Grace shut the blinds and tried to shake the creeping unease clawing at her. She called her friend Lily, hoping to laugh it off. "You're probably overthinking it," Lily said. "Maybe he's waiting for someone or lives nearby." Grace wanted to believe her, but the pit in her stomach said otherwise. The man returned every night that week. Sometimes he was closer, other times further away, but always in her line of sight. By Friday, she was too anxious to sleep. She stared at the shadowy outline of his figure from her bedroom window until the early hours of the morning. Then he did something new. He waved. The gesture was slow, deliberate. A chill ran down her spine, and she ducked out of sight, heart hammering in her chest. She spent the rest of the night crouched on the floor, phone in hand, ready to dial 911. The next morning, she told the landlord about the man and asked if the building's security cameras might have caught anything. But when they reviewed the footage, there was no sign of anyone outside her apartment. Grace felt her blood run cold. That evening, she locked every door and window, triple-checking each one. As she sat curled up on the couch, a knock echoed from her front door. Her breath caught. She crept toward the peephole, terrified of what she might see. But the hallway was empty. When she opened the door a crack, a single piece of paper was taped to it. In shaky, childlike handwriting, it read, "You look even prettier when you're scared." Grace slammed the door shut and called the police. When they arrived, they searched the building but found nothing. The officers were polite but dismissive, chalking it up to a prank. The following night, Grace couldn't bring herself to stay at home. She packed a bag and went to Lily's house, feeling safer in the company of her friend. But as she settled into the guest room, her phone buzzed with a notification. It was from the motion sensor on her doorbell camera. With trembling hands, she opened the app. The video showed the man, his face now clearly visible, standing inches from her door. His lips curled into a smile, and he raised a single finger to his lips in a shushing gesture before walking away. The police were called again, but once more, the man was gone by the time they arrived. Grace felt like she was losing her mind. How could someone keep slipping through unnoticed? How could he know her routine so well? She decided to stay at Lily's for a while, but her stalker wasn't deterred. On the third night at Lily's, she woke to the sound of soft tapping on the bedroom window. She froze, her body paralyzed with fear. The guest room was on the second floor. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. Gathering all her courage, she peeked through the curtain. There he was, perched on the window ledge, grinning at her. His face was pale and gaunt, his eyes wide and unblinking. He mouthed something she couldn't hear but understood perfectly. "You can't hide." Screaming, she bolted from the room. Lily called the police, who arrived within minutes. But just like before, the man was gone, and there was no sign he had ever been there. No footprints, no scuff marks on the wall, nothing. Grace left town the next morning, retreating to her parents' house in the countryside, hoping to escape the nightmare. For weeks, things were quiet. She began to relax, convincing herself the ordeal was over. Then, one night, she heard a faint scratching at her bedroom window. Her stomach dropped. Slowly, she turned toward the sound. There, pressed against the glass, was a familiar face, grinning from ear to ear. And this time, he was inside. The first sign that something was wrong came in the form of a text message. Rachel had just gotten home from her late shift at the diner and was about to collapse into bed when her phone buzzed. The message was from an unknown number, and it read, "I like the blue hoodie you wore today." Her stomach dropped. She had worn that hoodie to work. She checked the time, 11:47 p.m. The diner had been quiet tonight, the usual stream of customers replaced by only a handful of tired faces. None of them stood out. She typed a quick response, "Who is this?" No reply came. She stared at her phone, uneasy, but exhaustion won out. She double-checked her locks, crawled into bed, and fell into a restless sleep. The next day, she told her coworker Elena about the text. "Probably just some creep," Elena said, rolling her eyes. "You've had weirdos before, right? Comes with the job." Rachel nodded, but this felt different. Still, she pushed the thought aside. That evening, her shift ended at the same time. The streets were quieter than usual as she walked home, her breath visible in the cool night air. She kept her head down, earbuds in, and tried to ignore the unsettling sensation of being watched. When she reached her apartment, her phone buzzed again. "You look even prettier when you're nervous." Her blood turned to ice. She turned quickly, scanning the dark street, but saw no one. Her hands shook as she unlocked her door, bolting it the moment she was inside. She stared at the message, heart pounding. Rachel decided to call the number. The line rang once, then twice before connecting. But there was no greeting, no sound, just silence on the other end. "Who is this?" she demanded, trying to keep her voice steady. The silence stretched, and then she heard it. Breathing. Slow, deliberate, and far too close. She hung up and blocked the number. That night, sleep was impossible. She stayed up with her lights on, flinching at every sound. When morning finally came, she went straight to the police. The officer at the desk was sympathetic but shrugged when she explained the situation. "No direct threats," he said. "Could just be a prank." Rachel left feeling no safer. She installed a cheap security camera outside her apartment and kept her phone clutched in her hand at all times. For a few days, things seemed normal. Then, late one night, the motion alert from her camera woke her up. She opened the app and nearly dropped her phone. The video feed showed a man standing directly in front of her door. He was dressed in all black, his hood pulled up and his head tilted slightly, as if listening. His hand reached out and gently brushed the doorknob before he stepped back and looked directly into the camera. Rachel's breath caught. His face was obscured by the hood, but his posture exuded confidence, even amusement. He gave the camera a slow, mocking wave before walking out of frame. The police came, but there wasn't much they could do. They advised her to stay with a friend or family member for a while. But Rachel didn't have family nearby, and her friends lived just as precariously as she did, paycheck to paycheck. The text started again a few nights later. "You're so much fun to watch. You sleep on your right side. Why is that? Don't bother closing the curtains. I prefer them open." Rachel began skipping work, terrified to leave her apartment. She hardly ate, hardly slept, spending every waking moment staring at her phone or the security feed. One night, as she sat in the living room, her phone buzzed. She didn't want to look, but her curiosity got the better of her. The text was a single word: smile. A knock sounded on her window. Her heart stopped. Slowly, she turned. The man was there, standing just outside the glass, his face fully visible for the first time. His eyes were wide and empty, his grin stretched too far, almost inhuman. He raised his phone, pointing it at her. The flash went off. She screamed, bolted for the bathroom, and locked the door. The police arrived within minutes, but the man was gone, and there were no signs of forced entry. Rachel moved out the next day, leaving behind everything she couldn't carry. Months passed. She stayed with friends, just bouncing from couch to couch, always looking over her shoulder. But the texts never stopped. No matter how many numbers she changed, no matter how far she ran, they always found her. The last message she received before throwing her phone into a river chilled her to the core. "You can't hide forever. I'll see you soon." It started with a package. Marissa found it on her porch after work, wrapped in brown paper and tied with a string. There was no return address, no shipping label, just her name scrawled in uneven black ink. She didn't recall ordering anything, but curiosity got the better of her. Inside was a single item, an old, scratched Polaroid camera. No note, no instructions, nothing to indicate who sent it. She frowned, turning the camera over in her hands. It felt heavy, its plastic worn smooth from use. She almost tossed it in the trash, but decided to keep it. It was strange, but kind of cool in a retro way. That evening, as she sat in her living room scrolling through her phone, she decided to test the camera. She aimed it at the window, where the streetlight cast a faint glow through the curtains, and pressed the shutter. The camera clicked loudly, and a photograph began to develop. Marissa shook the Polaroid and waited. When the image finally came into view, she frowned. It wasn't the window. It was a man. He stood just outside her living room, his face half hidden in shadow, staring directly at her. Marissa's heart raced as she dropped the photo. She ran to the window, yanking the curtains aside. The street outside was empty. No one was there. She tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was an old photo somehow left in the camera. That had to be it. Feeling uneasy, she locked all the doors and went to bed, leaving the camera on the coffee table. The next morning, she found another photo. It was lying face down on the floor beside her bed. She picked it up with trembling hands and flipped it over. The picture showed her asleep in her bed, taken from the foot of the mattress. Her stomach churned. She checked every lock, every window, every door in her house. There was no sign of a break-in. How could someone have been in her room? She grabbed the camera, intending to throw it away, but hesitated. Something about it compelled her, as if the camera itself was watching her. That night, she couldn't sleep. The house felt wrong, too quiet. She kept the light on and the camera on the nightstand, staring at it like it might move on its own. Around 3 a.m., she heard it, the sound of the shutter clicking. Her breath caught. She hadn't touched the camera. Slowly, she reached for it, her fingers trembling. There was a new photograph developing in the slot. When the image finally appeared, her blood ran cold. The photo was of her sitting in her bed, staring at the camera. But in the picture, someone else was behind her, standing in the doorway. She spun around, heart pounding, but the doorway was empty. The rest of the night passed in terror. She didn't sleep, clutching her phone and debating whether to call the police. When morning finally came, she shoved the camera into a box and drove out to a nearby lake. Without hesitation, she threw the camera as far as she could into the water, watching it sink beneath the surface. For the first time in days, she felt relief, but it didn't last. That night, she found another photo on her kitchen counter. It showed the lake where she had thrown the camera, and in the water, barely visible beneath the surface, was a distorted face staring up at her. The text started the following day. "You shouldn't have done that. You can't get rid of me. Smile for the camera." Marissa didn't know how they were coming. The number was untraceable. Every time she tried to block it, new messages arrived from another number. The last message she received was a photograph. It showed her standing at the lake's edge, tossing the camera into the water. But this time, the photo revealed what she hadn't seen that day. Someone was standing just behind her, watching. Late one evening, Stephanie was driving home from her best friend's house, taking the back roads as she always did. The narrow two-lane road cut through thick woods, winding and dark, with no streetlights to guide her. She liked the solitude of the drive, until that night. It started when she noticed headlights in her rearview mirror. A car was following her, close enough that its beams illuminated the inside of her car. She frowned and tapped her brakes lightly, hoping the driver would back off. Instead, the car stayed unnervingly close. Stephanie tried to shake the driver by speeding up, but the car matched her pace. She slowed down. So did they. The pressure of their lights on her back felt suffocating. She turned onto a side road, hoping the driver would keep going. They didn't. They followed her. The road was even darker now, the trees looming overhead like walls. Her pulse quickened as the car inched closer. After a few minutes, she saw a small gas station ahead, a glowing beacon in the otherwise endless dark. She pulled into the lot and parked near the entrance, hoping the driver would keep going. They didn't. The car stopped a few spaces away, its engine still running. Stephanie stayed in her car, pretending to scroll on her phone. She could see the driver through her side mirror, a figure silhouetted in the car's cabin, but the details were obscured by the glare of their headlights. She debated going into the gas station, but something told her not to leave the safety of her locked car. She decided to call her friend. "Hey," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Can you stay on the line? There's a car following me. They're parked here now." Her friend immediately told her to drive to the nearest police station. Stephanie agreed and started her car. The moment she did, the other car's engine roared to life. Her heart pounded as she pulled out of the lot. The car followed. She drove faster now, her hands gripping the wheel. The police station wasn't far, but the stretch of road leading there was long and isolated. Her rearview mirror was filled with the other car's blinding lights, so close it felt like they could reach out and touch her bumper. Then, as suddenly as they had started following her, the car veered off onto a side road, disappearing into the night. Stephanie's breath hitched. She didn't stop until she reached the police station. She parked out front and ran inside, trembling as she told the officer at the desk what had happened. The officer was sympathetic but said there wasn't much they could do without a license plate or a clearer description of the driver. They offered to patrol the area and advised her to be careful. Feeling uneasy but slightly relieved, Stephanie drove home. She double-checked every lock before going to bed, her mind replaying the night's events. But the worst was yet to come. At 3 a.m., she woke to the sound of her phone buzzing. It was a text from an unknown number. "Why did you go to the cops? That wasn't very smart." Her blood turned to ice. Before she could process the message, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a photo. The picture showed her house. The lights were off, but it was unmistakably her front porch. Her heart raced as she crept to the window, peeking through the blinds. The street outside was empty, her driveway bathed in the faint glow of the moon. She backed away from the window, grabbing her phone to call the police. As she waited for them to arrive, her phone buzzed once more. Another photo. This one was taken from inside her house. It showed her, standing by the window, looking out. Lena moved into her new apartment with a sense of excitement. It was a modest place, tucked away on the 5th floor of an old brick building. The rent was cheap, and it came fully furnished. The landlord, an older man with tired eyes, had seemed almost too eager to hand over the keys. Her first night there, she noticed something strange. The bedroom closet had a mirror built to the door. It was cracked in one corner, giving it an almost spiderweb effect. When she looked at her reflection, she felt off. The room behind her seemed dimmer, her own image slightly distorted. She shook it off as her imagination. By the third night, the noises started. At first, it was faint, a soft tapping sound that seemed to come from the closet. She tried to ignore it, blaming old pipes or settling wood, but as the hours dragged on, the tapping grew louder, more insistent. Lena sat up in bed, staring at the closet door. The mirror seemed to shimmer faintly, reflecting only darkness. Summoning her courage, she got up and slid the door open. Nothing was there. The next morning, she told herself she was being ridiculous. Still, she avoided looking at the mirror directly, especially at night. Things escalated quickly. One evening, while brushing her teeth, Lena caught movement in the mirror out of the corner of her eye. She froze. It wasn't her reflection moving. It was something behind her. She spun around, but her bedroom was empty. Her heart pounded as she turned back to the mirror. For a brief moment, she saw it, a figure standing just behind her, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, eyes wide and unblinking. The image disappeared almost instantly, leaving her staring at her pale, terrified reflection. That night, the tapping returned, louder than ever. It wasn't random anymore. It was rhythmic, like someone knocking in a slow, deliberate pattern. Tap, 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 tap. Lena huddled in bed, clutching her phone, too scared to move. She decided to call her landlord. He answered groggily, clearly irritated by her late-night call. "Listen," she said, her voice shaking. "There's something wrong with this apartment, the closet mirror." Before she could finish, the landlord interrupted. "Get rid of the mirror," he said flatly. "I should have done it years ago." "What do you mean?" she asked, but he hung up. The next day, Lena tried to remove the mirror, but it was bolted to the closet door. Frustrated and scared, she draped a blanket over it, determined not to see her reflection again. That night, she woke to the sound of the blanket sliding off the mirror. Her room was freezing, her breath visible in the faint glow of the streetlights filtering through the window. The tapping started again, louder and closer this time. Tap, 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 tap. She sat frozen as the mirror began to vibrate, faintly at first, then violently. A crack split through the glass, spidering out from the original break. Then the knocking stopped. Lena let out a shaky breath. Maybe it was over. But as she reached for her phone, the closet door creaked open on its own. The mirror was empty. Her reflection was gone. Instead, the surface was filled with darkness, like an open void. And from that void, something stepped out. It was the figure from before, but now it was tangible. Its limbs were impossibly long, its head tilted to the side, that same unblinking stare fixed on her. Lena screamed and bolted for the door, but the thing moved faster than any human could. It was suddenly in front of her, blocking her path. Its face was inches from hers now, its mouth stretching into a too-wide grin. The last thing Lena saw was her own terrified face reflected in its eyes. When the landlord came to check on her the next day, the apartment was empty. Her belongings were still there, but Lena was gone. The only thing out of place was the mirror. It was cracked in more places now, and if you looked closely, you could see something faint within its surface. Lena's face, staring out in silent, eternal terror. Matt was a delivery driver for a small courier company, and his shifts often stretched late into the night. He didn't mind. The solitude suited him. The streets were quieter, and he could make his runs without the hassle of traffic or crowds. But one night, a delivery would lead him somewhere he wished he'd never gone. It started as a regular drop-off. His dispatcher sent him an address on the outskirts of town, past a stretch of woods he'd never driven through before. The GPS directed him down a narrow, winding road with no streetlights. The trees formed a tunnel overhead, their branches gnarled and clawing at the sky. The house came into view suddenly, emerging from the shadows like it had been waiting for him. It was old and sagging, with peeling paint and boarded-up windows. The porch light flickered weakly. He double-checked the address. This was the place. Matt grabbed the package, a small box wrapped in brown paper, and approached the house. The air felt heavier as he climbed the creaking steps. He knocked on the door, but there was no answer. He waited a moment, then knocked again. A voice, faint and raspy, called from inside. "Come in, the door's open." Something about the voice sent a chill down his spine. Against his better judgment, he twisted the doorknob and stepped inside. The house smelled of mildew and decay. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper that seemed to sag under its own weight. The floorboards groaned beneath his feet. He called out, "Delivery!" but no one answered. As he stepped further inside, he noticed something odd. The house seemed bigger on the inside, the hallway stretching longer than it should have. Shadows danced along the walls, even though there was no discernible light source. He set the package down on a small table near the entrance, eager to leave. When he heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper. It wasn't clear at first, but as he stood frozen, the words became clearer. "Stay. Don't leave yet." Matt turned toward the voice, his heart pounding. A figure stood at the end of the hallway, barely visible in the dim light. It was a woman, her face pale and expressionless, her eyes dark and sunken. She didn't move, didn't blink. I just delivered the package," he stammered. "I'm leaving now." The woman tilted her head, her mouth twisting into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You can't leave yet. He hasn't met you." "Who?" Matt asked, his voice barely a whisper. The woman pointed to a door at the end of the hall. Slowly it creaked open, revealing nothing but darkness inside. A low growl emanated from the room, deep and guttural, vibrating through the walls. Matt's instincts screamed at him to run, but his feet felt rooted to the floor. Then something moved in the shadows beyond the door. At first it was just a shape, but as it stepped into the faint light, Matt's blood ran cold. It was tall, unnaturally so, with limbs that seemed to stretch impossibly long. Its skin was gray and mottled, its face a featureless void except for a gaping maw filled with jagged teeth. The creature lunged. Matt bolted for the door, adrenaline finally overriding his terror. He sprinted across the porch, leaped into his van, and peeled out of the driveway. He didn't stop until he reached the safety of a well-lit gas station miles away. Shaking, he called his dispatcher to explain why he hadn't gotten a signature for the delivery. "There's no one there," the dispatcher said after a long pause. "What do you mean?" Matt demanded. "That house. It's been abandoned for years. You must have gone to the wrong place." Matt stared at his phone, disbelief washing over him. But when he glanced at the passenger seat, his blood turned to ice. The package he delivered was sitting there untouched, and scrawled across the top in smeared black ink were the words, "We'll see you again soon."